I'm Ellis Martin. Join me now for a conversation with Adam Smith, co-founder and vice president of business development for Oroco Resource Corp, a public mineral exploration company trading on the TSX Venture Exchange under the symbol OCO, and in the U.S. on the OTCQB market under the symbol ORRCF. Oroco is focused on the development of a large copper deposit in the Santo Tomas project in coastal northwest Mexico. Oroco currently has an 8.5 billion pound copper endowment announced in May of this year after an extensive drill program. Copper mineralization at Santo Tomas is located at surface and therefore potentially amenable to low-cost mining methods. It's very well located with respect to the infrastructure that's essential to a large mining operation, and Mexico is among the world's top mining jurisdictions, with laws and trade agreements that protect the rights of mining companies. Since commencing exploration and resource definition at Santo Tomas 3 years ago, Oroco has made a series of rapid advances. These milestones will be achieved against the backdrop of a positive forecast for the price of copper, possibly to historical highs, as a result of dramatic shifts in metal's importance to industrial and consumer markets. Adam, welcome back to the program. Great to have you on the show with us today.
Thanks, Ellis. Always good to be here, and good to be here in particular on the day after you experienced a hurricane. Good to see you doing well.
Thank you. It wasn't as bad as people predicted. The Inland Empire got slammed a bit. Palm Desert got kind of deluge, but over here on the coast here in Malibu, we seem to be doing just fine. And I've been looking at some of the comments that people have been leaving for us on YouTube and other places regarding Oroco, and they're wanting to know what's happening with the company. Why are we talking if there's nothing substantive to talk about at the moment? And I just think that there's a huge supply crunch coming for copper. And to give you an idea where I'm coming from here, I'm heading back to New York for my 50th high school reunion in a few days, Adam. And when I was living in New York, growing up in the Hudson Valley, I was obsessed with copper. I built a hand crank generator with copper core to it and mag cranking out electricity. I built an electric car, a small one, in 1965 when I was 10 years old. In 1970, in high school, I covered pollution, air pollution. This was just as the EPA was getting going, and we had a debate on it. And I prepared for days and days and days. Here we are, 53, 54 years later, and we're just getting going on enhancing the grid, electric cars. Why the huge gap, in your opinion? And why the rush now? This should have just happened years ago.
This should have. I recall as well in the 1970s in high school learning about these things and being anxious as a consequence. And I think all of our generation were aware of the science, aware of the technology. Since that time, a lot of these technologies are only coming to the fore right now. And quite interestingly, a few decades late from the perspective of some of us, but the New York Times published a trio of articles titled "The Clean Energy Future is Arriving Faster Than You Think." And this was published about a week ago. Subtitled, "The United States is Pivoting Away from Fossil Fuels and Towards Wind, Solar, and Other Renewable Energy Areas, even in areas dominated by oil and gas industries." It goes on to say, across the country, a profound shift is taking place that is nearly invisible to most Americans. The nation that burned coal, oil, and gas for more than a century to become the world's richest economy, as well as historically the most polluting, is rapidly shifting away from fossil fuels. A similar energy transition is already well underway in Europe and elsewhere, but the United States is catching up. And I think it's important to cite here, as this article does, some of the forces that are bringing that to play. It's not necessarily ideological, it's not necessarily political, it is economic. Renewable energy has become some of the cheapest in many markets. Certainly in the American Southwest, renewable energy in the middle part of America where the wind blows constantly, renewable energy has become the most cost-effective. You add to that political incentives, economic incentives that come from the Inflation Reduction Act and other pieces of legislation. And there are trillions of dollars, not just billions, but there are trillions of dollars moving into that sector. The U.S. electrical energy transmission grid, for instance, currently has about $1.3 trillion of copper in it. It is estimated that that has to increase by 30 to 40% in the coming generation. So it's not just billions, but it's trillions of dollars that's needed through all sectors, through all phases. Energy generation through renewable means is far more copper intensive than through fossil fuels. The transmission of electricity requires great deals of copper. And the end uses, cooling, heating, kinetic energy, like the motor of an electric car, for instance, again, very copper intensive. So The United States is finally catching up, and I think catching up in the best way, because of economics will drive decision-making more than any other factor. And we see that now aligned between the three biggest economic drivers in the world: the US economy, the European economy, and China. China has, of course, tremendous head start on renewable energy technology and implementation. But with the United States now in the mix, those forecasts of increased copper consumption are really starting to take shape in ways that we as North American investors can see firsthand. The increased use of copper over the next generation, over the next several years, as a matter of fact, is expected to vastly exceed the world's ability to produce copper, at least as it's understood today. The number of new mines that are needed to supply copper and other metals exceeds what is currently on the drawing board. And in the case of copper, the number of new mines in the pipeline to be put in production over the coming decade or so is at historical lows. It's lower than it was 25 years ago, prior to the emergence of China as a huge consumer of copper. And we saw what happened there. Copper prices increased sevenfold between 2001 and 2013. So we've got fewer projects to put in production than we had during that phase. We've got larger increases in copper consumption coming than we had during that so-called super cycle. And that is indeed a formula for higher copper prices. Projects like Santo Tomas, with its recently announced £8.5 billion copper endowment at surface, in a favorable jurisdiction, in a jurisdiction which will benefit from U.S. legislation that favors its trading partners, like Mexico, is set to be one of those deposits that sees a benefit from these trends.
Thank you for that comprehensive dissertation on copper. I think it's important for our audience to understand the scope of the benefit and the problem that we have right now. If you could explain the case for the equities, though, like gold, like all the other metals now in the junior mining space, there's a huge disparity between the price of the metal itself and the stocks. Let's talk about positioning oneself for the eventual closing of that gap in copper prices and equities.
We have a parallel, and that parallel is the super cycle that ran from between approximately 2001 until 2013. Copper prices, as I mentioned earlier, increased sevenfold. Equities followed. It was a bull market for those companies that mined and floored for metals. When the underlying value of the metal increases in value, of course, the value of the company's assets will increase, their earnings will increase. But there's also a lot of attention that comes into those sectors. Most of the time, most of us don't pay attention to the metals around us, the fossil fuel that drives our cars, etc. And it's a saying in the mining business, it doesn't matter until it matters. And when it matters, there's a lot of attention focused on commodities. Oroco is in the process right now of doing a preliminary economic assessment on its Santo Tomas deposit, which is a report which covers the capital cost and the operating cost and the projected cash flow of our Santo Tomas deposit. One of the variables in that preliminary economic assessment, or PEA, is the price of copper. When you increase the price of copper in these discounted cash flow models that are part of the PEA, you see the net present value rise, and not just rise arithmetically, but it rises exponentially. Your margins increase not in a linear fashion, but they increase in an exponential fashion. So the net present value of Oroco's asset, of the assets of major mining companies, starts to increase quite significantly with an increase in commodity prices. I think we've got other factors that make the sector even more exciting, and one where I think people should consider a position in copper over the coming months or years, really. And that is that we are at a point in history where copper, and I think there's a number of metals that are in a similar position, we're just not discovering it at the rate that we used to. And those discoveries that we're making require significantly higher prices of copper to make them economic. They're deeper, the grades are lower, etc. So we don't get that supply coming online until copper prices increase from where they are today. So the discovery of large amounts of copper that was taking place in the 1990s and into the early noughts has fallen off a cliff in the last decade. The number of major discoveries in the last 5 or 6 or even 8 years dwarfs what was made in any single year in the 1990s. Those discoveries in the 1990s are in production. Some of them are in the process of decline from age, and we're not going to be able to meet future copper demands unless we significantly step up investment in copper production and do so at higher copper prices that are needed to justify those tougher to mine deposits. So assets, relatively easy to mine assets at service that are amenable to low-cost open pit mining methods like Santo Tomas will benefit exponentially. And I think that's what investors should be aware of, that there's trillions of dollars of investment coming into renewable energies. All the major economies in the world are lined up behind that goal. The economics point to future energy supplies as coming from renewables, and that involves the generation of electricity through wind, solar, nuclear power, for instance. That requires the transmission of that electricity in many cases over large distances. Sending energy generated by wind turbines in the middle of the United States to the coasts, for instance, requires significantly increased investments in more robust electrical grids than currently exist in the United States. That's going to mean a lot for copper. And then, of course, when that electricity gets to its end user, it is turned into heat or cooling or kinetic energy via much more copper-intensive technologies than we utilize today.
It's all about energy transmission. Battery chemistry can change. Modes of generating electricity, whether it's nuclear or wind or solar, all those modes, they can change, they can vary, but you cannot convey electricity without copper, period. But yet there's a lithium buzz in the air. There's a potential nickel buzz in the air. There's all these things that the market likes right now that people look for. I'm constantly asked about lithium projects. I'm never really asked about copper projects, although most of my sponsors right now are copper oriented with a couple of exceptions. I don't think we're going to ever see a 4 or 5 banger with the price of copper itself with the metal, and then it's not economic. We could see that, and we probably will see that with the equities as soon as everybody starts thinking, by everybody, I mean everybody, I mean the institutions, all the investors, and the general public starts asking us, do you know of any good copper companies that you can talk about? It's just not in the air, but it will happen because the predictors are saying, well, the next flavor is going to be copper.
That's right. And everybody in the mining industry, those people who are in the business of planning the national power grid, they understand what's coming. Mining executives are somewhere between realization and panic in terms of the upcoming copper crunch. Copper is one of the top 5 traded mined commodities in the world. Oil and gas, aluminum, copper, steel are the big number. Those are commodities traded in the multi-hundred of billions of dollars per year. All the other metals, they're big, they're important, they're required for certain technologies, but none of those other metals are common across all of the possible technologies of future energy generation and usage. Copper is the center of that industry, the center of those technologies. It's why Goldman Sachs called copper the new oil, being the commodity that will be in focus in the coming century to modernize and power our lives. I guess it's staring us in the face. It's one of the biggest commodities that's needed. It's going to be facing a huge crunch as the paucity of discoveries, the lack of mines on the drawing board meet increased demand as soon as 2025 by most predictions. So it is something that I think investors should be looking at. They have a choice of major mining companies with a copper component. There's no major mining companies out there that are pure play coppers investments, or they could look at the mid-tier companies that are the smaller companies with mostly copper production, or they could look at companies like Oroco, which is a very pure play copper investment. Our market cap is currently about $150 million. The value of the metal in the ground, $8.5 billion multiplied by today's copper price of, I think it's $370 or so, multi-tens of billions of dollars of in situ metal value. So there's great leverage there. And there's even greater leverage, I think, as a consequence of where Oroco is in its phase of development. Recently announced a large copper endowment, and it's on its way to defining what that means in a preliminary economic assessment. So the future looks particularly bright for copper, even if the current market is ignoring commodities, but the pendulum will swing and investors will become more and more focused on it as it does. And I think the article in the New York Times last week could have been titled, "Tell us why copper and copper equities are going to boom," without using the word copper. There's 3,000 words on why the US is shifting with huge multi-billion and even trillion-dollar forces behind it towards a copper-intensive decade or 2 or 3.
Adam, it's always great to catch up with you. Each time I seem to learn quite a bit, and I hope our audience is as well. Thank you so much for joining me today on the program. I look forward to chatting with you again in a few weeks.
You're very welcome, Ellis. As you can tell, I'm always keen to evangelize on the subject of copper. Very encouraged that it's going to start to come into focus, as the New York Times article of last week indicated. I'll be happy to share a link with you and listeners. Look on Oroco's Twitter page, or I'll provide you with a link and perhaps it can be attached to this broadcast.
I've been speaking with Adam Smith, co-founder and vice president of business development for Oroco Resource Corp. Oroco trades on the TSX Venture Exchange under the symbol OCO, and in the U.S. on the OTCQB market under the ticker symbol ORRCF. Go to the company's website, orocoresourcecorp.com. For Adam Smith and Oroco Resource Corp, I'm Ellis Martin.
Would you like to be one of the first to see who we are following? Subscribe to our audio newsletter. It's free. EllisMartinReport.com.